Okay, we're into second talk of today. I don't think Andrew needs a long introduction because Ian Stewart gave him a long introduction on Thursday. But to those that have just arrived, Andrew is the Creed C. Black Associate Professor of Philosophy and a member of the Bass Society of Fellows. What's that?
Oh, it's a secret.
Okay. It's a secret society. Look at his ring. At Duke. I know Andrew from way back when we were both fellows at the Dibner Institute giving George Smith a hard time before they bulldozed it to the ground. Even then we saw that this was going to be a real upcoming star in the field of philosophy of science and also in Newton studies. And he has certainly lived up to that expectation. Andrew, you got a half an hour powerless point, not here, thank you. Starting now. Cheers.
Thank you. He's very strict. He's warned me about the time like 5 times. So I have a watch. It's now 11 seconds after 10:20, according to me. Synchronize your watches, please. Anyway, thank you very much. It's very kind. I'm glad. I think I'm just going to wander around. This is a small group. It seems absurd to stand at a lectern. Anyway, there is a one-page eco-friendly handout, which I will refer to. Some of it is very familiar. Some of it you might have just forgotten or something. So what I'm going to try to tell you about is the general Scholium seen from a historical philosophical point of view. So I'm actually not going to be talking about its apparent theological aspects. I'm going to be talking about its philosophical aspects. Now that is a difficult distinction to make, but I think it's one we can all appreciate in some depth when we get there. And my attitude is that although it's obviously a document that is connected to the debate with Leibniz and has to be read in that context and was composed during a heated dispute with the Leibnizians, as we all know, the Cartesian background to the general Scholium is also important. And now one tiny note, I mean, some people have been saying Leibniz is a Cartesian. Of course, he is working in a Cartesian tradition of thinking that a metaphysical foundation for studying nature is absolutely essential, something that is highly contested by Newtonians in different ways. But Leibniz also has his own very idiosyncratic point of view. And so I won't take him to represent the Cartesians. I'll take the Cartesians to have a distinct tradition from the Leibnizians. And I'll be arguing a little bit or suggesting that the general Scholium has philosophical aspects that have to be read in context with Descartes or the Cartesians' views and Newton's continuing rejection of those views. Okay, one reason you might take this seriously, if you immediately think, no, it's all about the Leibnizians, is that there's a part of the text in the second edition that didn't change. That's absolutely central to understanding some of what's happening with respect to space in the general Scholium, namely the original Scholium on space and time. This is in all the 3 editions. There is absolutely no doubt, thanks partly to the fantastic work of Alexandre Coiré, that the Scholium on space and time was misread for a long time. And philosophers thought, oh, well, this is about Leibnizian ideas about space being somehow relational and the Newtonian idea, and we all know how that goes. In fact, of course, it was composed at a time when Newton essentially knew nothing about Leibnizian ideas of space to the extent that there were any. He knew about Leibniz's work in mathematics from 1676. So it was written against a Cartesian view. And there are a number of passages that scholars have pointed out in great depth in the Scholium on space and time in 1687, which occur again in 1713, that really only make sense if you've thought about space and time and motion from a Cartesian point of view. You know, if an object is moving, that means that the parts within it are also moving. And I often teach this, and students say, like, why in the world would Newton say that? It's true, but so obvious. Well, because if you look at the definition of proper motion in part 2 of Descartes' principles, it isn't clear that the Cartesians think that that's correct. Or anyway, it's a very complicated issue in the Cartesian theory of motion. Okay, you guys know all of that stuff, but in any case, that's part of the important background to my talk, namely, the Scholium remains unchanged, and so the Newtonian ideas about distinguishing mathematical, true, etc., views of absolute views of space, time, and motion, and common, apparent, and relative ideas about space, time, and motion is retained in the second edition, and that informs how I read the general Scholium. Okay, the other thing I'm going to just say as a kind of background is that, because I rewrote my talk on the basis of what other people have said, and that's a really great feature of this conference. The other thing is that I think, would you like a handout? It's free. I think that when we talk about some of these comments in the general Scholium about God, and we say, I have no doubt that you are right, they might be theologically commonplace. To me, what's so interesting is that some of the comments, the ones that I'll talk about, are philosophically disputed. So at one and the same time, a sentence about God's omnipresence might be a theological commonplace in a particular moment in history, and yet a philosophically disputed claim at the same time. And of course, this is why we always have to be so careful when we say things like, science or religion. I mean, I think we all agree on that. Because in fact, it might be that a claim is highly disputed in first philosophy or metaphysics, not disputed in natural theology, one and the same time at the same historical moment. Anyway, we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I'm going to try to say something, hopefully slightly enlightening, about passages that you all know about. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that Newton is well aware of how philosophically contested some of his claims are. So I actually have the general Scholium over here. I'm sure you all have it in all editions, multiple languages. But let me just point out this as a kind of framing comment. "'Tis allowed by all," I guess this is the Mott translation. "'Tis allowed by all that the supreme God exists necessarily." Well, that's true. That is allowed by all. I think both philosophically and theologically, this is not a controversial statement. God exists necessarily, unlike everything else. By the same necessity, he exists always and everywhere. That is not allowed by many people. That is highly disputed. And in fact, oh, it's not on the handout. Well, it is on his multiple general Scholium handouts. I'm just reading it. You've all heard this line many, many times. So in one and the same sentence, you have a statement that is, banal, God exists necessarily, and an interpretation of that, or at least what he thinks is a corollary of it, that's highly contested, both by the Cartesians and by the Leibnizians. And of course, I'll just remind you, you know very well, in 1713, when the second edition is published, Cartesianism is alive and well in many regards in Europe, and Newton is well aware of this. And of course, there's a debate amongst Cartesians and Newtonians, and there's a debate amongst Leibnizians and Newtonians. And partly it is about this very thing. So Leibniz writes a number of letters right before this, 1711, 1712. He writes a letter to Wolff, I think in 1712. I didn't get a chance to look it up, but I remember it very well. Leibniz tells Wolff, Newton cherishes, I'm just kind of translating loosely, astonishing ideas about God. So two of the leading philosophers, mathematicians of this time discussing Newton think there's something astonishing about what he's saying about the divine being. Okay, I'm going to try to talk about that. So far, so good. So now we're going to kind of go through the handout, and I'll just try to tell you what I think part of the context here is for these things, and that happens partly in this Cartesian vein. So part of what I'm trying to talk about is the idea that Newton is thinking in part about a Cartesian tradition and thinking about the divine being when he says, certainly the maker and lord of all things will not be never or nowhere. He thought that the Cartesians were committed to the idea that God is nowhere. And he fundamentally rejects that point of view. I think that probably is not going to be controversial. I'll explain that if need be. But there's another aspect to the general Scholium where I think there's a philosophical dispute about infinity that is also part of the background here. And that relates, I think, much more closely to Newton's interpretation of the Cartesian tradition and probably less with respect to the Leibnizian tradition. And this is actually a very interesting, complex topic I can't possibly explain in any great depth, but I will tell you a little bit about that. So, of course, Descartes' principles, we all know, he says something that is greatly upsetting to a number of philosophers in England in the middle century, including Henry More. And I'm going to use More. I know that his status has been put under dispute, which is a good thing. I think we have to get as precise as we can. But I do think he plays something of an important role here in shaping Newton's reactions to Cartesian ideas about infinity and also about the divine. So Descartes' principles, you all remember, it's a really fascinating thing. And if I were an historian of mathematics, I probably would have a much richer account of how Descartes' understanding of certain problems in mathematics is connected to his philosophical reluctance to discuss the infinite at all. But he says very clearly in part one of the principles, we don't want to get involved in arguments about the infinite. We should, instead of saying that the world is infinite or the number of stars is infinite and so on, we should say that they are indefinite. Only God is infinite. Nothing else is so. Part of his reason for saying that is in the gloss on part 1, section 26, Descartes says, you know, the problem is if you say that you're going to involve yourself in thinking about the infinite, people will start raising questions that are, I think you could say, tiresome would be the translation. For example, someone tells you, is an infinite number even or odd, right? These are famous examples. Or if you have a line that's a certain finite length and then a line segment, another line segment that's twice as large, and they're both infinitely divisible. Is one bigger than the other? Are they actually equal? You get all these proofs by reductio ad absurdum. You get paradoxes. So Descartes says, let's just forget about all of that. We'll just say that everything in the world, and the implication is partly certain questions in mathematics, should be dealt with by using this idea that they are indefinite and not infinite. Section 27, the very next one is, reserve the term infinite for God alone. OK, that's the Cartesian view, 1644. Now, what's so interesting to me is that Henry More focuses on that exact issue. I think More is a fantastically insightful critic of Cartesian metaphysics, and rivaled only by Princess Elizabeth, I would say. The two of them homed in on some absolutely essential issues in mind-body dualism and so on that really are still relevant in the 20th century when people think about Descartes. And More says, and this is the next quotation on your handout, in December of 1648, this is of course near the end of Descartes' life, that he objects to this use of the idea that things are indefinite. In particular, the idea that space is indefinite, or of course matter. The material world is indefinite and not infinite. He says this indefinite extension, Descartes, is either infinite simplicator or infinite only to us. If you mean infinite extension simplicator, why do you hide your meaning with excessively modest words? Just say the world is infinite. If you mean infinite only for us, it's more like an epistemological idea. The extension will really be finite, for our mind is not the measure of things. That is, he's reacting to Descartes' idea that we think about extension and we can't perceive a limit to extension, either at the micro level or the macro level. So you think about some space consisting of material particles moving around maybe, right? Because you have a plenum. And as soon as you do that, you're already committed to the idea that it could be extended. Because of course you can just have some new particle in relation to all the previously existing particles. And the same thing if you think about a material object, you can divide it in half, and you can divide that in half, and so on. So Moore says you should either say the world really is finite, but our perception and cognition does not perceive it to have limits, which is an interesting idea. Or you should say the world really is infinite. Space or the material world is infinite. But you shouldn't ever use this idea of the indefinite. It's a philosophical mistake. Okay. Now, it's, of course, extremely tempting to quote from De Graaff Tatianna, because I think whenever that text was written, in however many stages, I have no theory of any of that. I respect debates about that, but I just don't know. Nonetheless, there's zero doubt Newton has a very similar reaction to Descartes' idea of the indefinite in the Principles. And he says Descartes should not say that extension is indefinite. And he thinks in part because, this is a little bit, this is a little bit abrasive. He should be corrected by grammarians. He says, look, the word indefinite, the concept of the indefinite, should apply only to possibilia, not to things that are actual. When something is actual, it is either a finite thing or an infinite thing, says Newton. I think following Moore's criticism. And so you can say of a future possibility that it's indefinite. So he takes indefinite to mean indeterminate. So, my granddaughter. Well, I don't have a granddaughter, so she has an indefinite height. It is not determined. But God willing, one day, if I have a granddaughter, then she will have an actual height. And it will no longer be a possible thing. It'll be an actual thing. So he rejects the use of this concept altogether. And part of what's important about that is, of course, we all know, Newton then says, no, space is infinite. It extends infinitely in all directions. This is not a trivial idea. This is a deeply problematic idea from a Cartesian point of view. That remained the case in 1713. It wasn't just true in 1648. And so we have to keep that in mind when we read the general Scholium, as I will try to explain. There's also one other issue from the Descartes-Moore correspondence that I think is especially significant in understanding what Newton says in the general Scholium. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about that. In fact, I might just read this. So this is related to a number of talks from yesterday. There's an old problem in the history of philosophy and the history of theology. How do you think about God's relation to the world? Right? People have debated various conservationist views, concurrence. There's occasionalism, of course, is a going concern in a Cartesian tradition. So if you think God is the primary cause of all motion, as Descartes says, then you have another way of understanding God's relation to the world, and so on. But one of the particular problems is, what inference do you draw from a commonly held assumption? The commonly held assumption is God's power is omnipresent. That has to be, in some sense, endorsed by everyone. Because if it weren't omnipresent, there would be some place, and how you define that place, of course, might differ, but let's leave that aside. There'd be some place where, as it were, God's power would not reach to that place, which really, of course, makes no sense, because that would mean, God couldn't instantiate a miracle right here. Surely no one wants to say that. You've got to say God's virtue or power is omnipresent. Regardless of your idea about the world, whether the world is infinite or finite, right? Whether the world is indefinite, etc. You've got to endorse that. Moore knows this. He's a very perceptive critic, as I said. So he thinks, wait a minute, if you're a Cartesian, how do you make sense of the omnipresent power of God? As we'll see, there's actually an analog in mind-body dualism that people often ignore. But we'll get to that in a second, or maybe if you're interested. Okay? So this is what Moore tries to say. Descartes, you are, of course, of the opinion that God's power is omnipresent. You must therefore endorse the idea that God's substance is omnipresent. And if you endorse the idea that God's substance is omnipresent, then you must think of God as extended in some way. Okay? Of course, Descartes is horrified by this. Descartes says, look, God is not extended because God has no parts. God can't be divided. God cannot be imagined. You can only reason about God. You can't imagine God. All of which Henry Moore agrees with. Yes, of course, God has to be extended in a very special way. But if you deny that God is extended, you have a problem understanding God's omnipresence in the right way. So he says, this is what Moore tells him. This is also December 1648, a correspondence well known to Newton and many others in Cambridge. Indeed, I judge that the fact that God is extended in his own way follows from the fact that he is omnipresent and intimately occupies the universal machine of the world and each of its parts. I think saying machine of the world is a way of characterizing it that Descartes would appreciate, right? For how could he have, now this is really fascinating, and of course I will not pontificate about action at a distance because I've already been refuted on that so many times that, although I do think it supports my point of view, but anyway, how could he have impressed motion on matter? But this is a Cartesian idea. God is the primary cause of motion, and Descartes really believes that. And of course, Malebranche eventually made that the centerpiece of metaphysics, which he did once and which you think he does even now. Unless he, as it were, touches the matter of the universe. God touches the matter, or at least did so once. This never could have happened unless he were everywhere and occupied every single place. Therefore, God is extended in his own way, not imaginable, not with parts, not divisible, and spread out. And so God is a res extensa, right? Clearly, the implication is that Descartes has already committed himself to a view, which he had agreed with earlier in the correspondence, of God's omnipresent power. And according to Moore, he must therefore take a further step and say God's substantial omnipresence is a consequence of God's omnipresent power. Okay, and therefore God is a res extensa. Now, clearly Descartes denies that God is a res extensa. However, there's very substantial evidence that Descartes understood that this is a deeply troubling issue for him. Part of the evidence in the manuscript is, in the correspondence, is that Descartes says, well, yes, it is true that there is no distinction between God's power and God's essence.
Sorry?
There is no distinction, Descartes says, between God's power and God's essence. Very traditional idea. Conclusion you might think is, well, then God's essence is omnipresent in some sense if God's power is omnipresent, since they're not distinct. But does he say that? No, he says, but it is very difficult to argue about God, connected to his idea about infinity, because God is the only infinite thing, and we don't want to talk about infinity. And so therefore, I would prefer to talk about other things. That's the last thing he says to Moore on this topic. And in particular, he'd rather talk about the mind, because he knows there's the same problem with the mind. If the mind has any causal power, does that commit you to thinking of the mind as being extended in some way, at least somehow present where its power is located? And of course, Moore thinks, yes, it does, and Descartes denies that. Okay. I'm pretty good on time, right? I have 10 minutes?
Yep.
By our synchronized. Okay. 8. 8. Okay, who's counting? All right. Isaac Newton wades directly into this exact philosophical dispute, and he does so, I think, in a very explicit way. He says, not only does God exist necessarily, but God is everywhere, as you know. And just in case anyone was unclear about this, he says, as we all know, this has been put on many slides and handouts, I think something that indisputably, everything's disputable, pretty clearly shows that he wanted to take a position on this exact philosophical dispute by saying God is omnipresent not only by power but also by substance. Because power or virtue without substance cannot subsist or cannot be, right? Okay. I take him to be saying God is substantially omnipresent, and it was an error of the Cartesians to deny that they were committed to that idea, even though they accepted the omnipotent power and omnipresent power of God. And that, of course, is exactly what Henry Moore was trying to get Descartes to agree with. So this statement, I take it, even if it's theologically banal, which it may very well be, is philosophically highly disputed. Now, the intriguing thing, of course, is that the Leibnizians are also simultaneously a target of this comment, because they deny, as the Cartesians do, that God has a substantial presence in space. Okay. Now, I also think that the infinity of God is important as well. Again, theologically, you might think, well, that's just one of the classic attributes, eternal, infinite, and so on, not important. But philosophically, how to understand the infinity of God, particularly through the lens of whether the world is infinite, is hotly disputed, and has been since 1648, when Moore and Descartes debated that exact issue, as we saw before. So I'm going to now, I have this kind of pedantic, but I wrote an argument down on the handout, because we were trained to do that, as philosophers. I actually think Newton is taking a very specific substantive philosophical position about space in the general Scholium, one that would have been hotly disputed by both a Cartesian reader of the text and a follower of Leibniz, if not Leibniz himself. Namely, he is not satisfied with saying that the world is indefinitely large, or that space in particular is indefinitely large as you like. Newton is saying, I think, that space is not just potentially infinite, using the old Aristotelian distinction, but actually infinite. And that is a position that would have been rejected by so many of his philosophical readers. So why is that? Well, because if you think that God's omnipresence is just limited to the power of the divine, then you have some conceptual room for thinking about the world in different ways. And you might be able to show, at least Descartes thought you could do this, that the world is just potentially infinite, you might say. Always finite, but without a limit. So, it can be as big as you like. You can, you're going along in the material world. You're never going to say, aha, here's the signpost, this is the end of the world, right? You don't have that Douglas Adams science fiction for your class thing. You have, you can go as arbitrarily far from any point, but always still finite. Newton, I think, is rejecting that. Why? Because if God's omnipresence is in substance, and not just in power, then you have to think, since God is actually infinite, which everyone agrees with, God must be present throughout an actually infinite space. So I think Newton is making the philosophical claim that you must regard space as actually infinite if you're going to understand God's actual substantial omnipresence in the right way. And that, again, is a hotly disputed claim. Both a Cartesian, as we already have seen, and a Leibnizian would reject the idea that space is actually infinite. And Leibniz makes it very clear in the correspondence, which of course, with Clarke, which of course follows the second edition pretty directly, that the Newtonian view of space and of God's relation to space is mistaken in about every respect that you can articulate. It's mistaken both on fundamental metaphysical grounds, because of the principle of sufficient reason, as you all know, because of an entailment of the principle of sufficient reason, namely the identity of indiscernibles, but also because it is the wrong view in natural philosophy, just thinking about forces and causal interactions and the material world in the right way. So it is mistaken both, if you want to speak anachronistically, which I know I shouldn't, but it's mistaken both in terms of a physical account of causal interactions and in terms of a metaphysical account. And I think this is actually connected to what I started with. So if you think about this idea of that everyone agrees God exists necessarily, Newton thinks by the same necessity he exists everywhere. That really only makes sense if you accept something that's disputed, namely that God's omnipresence involves the substance of God and not just the power. And that, of course, is exactly what Leibniz or Descartes would reject. There's obviously, I'm fine, right? I have a minute or two. There's obviously historical context with the dispute with the Leibnizians that's relevant for thinking about this. There is also a passage in the account which has been quoted, I was very glad to see, right, when he talks about the intelligentia supermundana in 1715. And it's clear he's thinking of Leibniz. And Newton is being, he's very short there. He's being a bit opportunistic and saying, well, the Leibnizians are committed to a view of God according to which he is not present to the material world, and that, from Newton's point of view, is a fundamental error. But this was not, as far as I can see, a deep aspect of Newton's thinking about Leibniz in 1712 or 1713. Although he was able to say that, I think it's a deep aspect of Newton's thinking about space and God that reaches back to his earliest days in thinking about the errors of the Cartesian view, which were partly pointed out by Henry Moore. And so in that respect, I don't think we should fall prey to the idea that either this is an argument against a Cartesian or a Leibnizian. It can, of course, play both roles. But nonetheless, I think we have to remember this long history of engaging with Cartesian ideas that I think still shapes Newton's thinking about space, time, and motion very deeply. And as I say, part of the reason for thinking that is he decides not to change the Scholium, which surely was composed in careful relation to Cartesian ideas that he had regarded as fundamentally mistaken. Thanks.
Okay, we have
pretty good, right? That's
13 and a half minutes.
60 seconds over.
And people should go up to the mic, start from going. And then okay, like everyone, okay. Just crowd up there.
Are you okay with that?
It was an interesting talk, Andrew, but there's actually pedigree for Newton's position on the actual infinity of space. And it comes out of the Animistic tradition, and it goes like this. It is logically impossible that that which is actually infinite can have anything outside it. There is no limit. So that's the real sense of the apeiron, okay? So that immediately rules out a potential infinity, all right? So that comes straight out of the Animistic tradition. I talk about it in the Quaestiones edition.
Yes.
He got it through the philosophy of oh Jesus, I'm blocking. I'll talk to you later, but I can pinpoint the exact source, how he knew it.
Yeah.
And Tammy and I reconstruct the argument and show how it fits in.
Yes.
So it's a way of underwriting actual infinity. Okay?
Yes.
Because for Newton, of course, infinity in itself, and this is an important point, infinity in itself is not a perfection.
Yes, right.
It has to be something that is perfect and which can be infinitely perfect.
Yes.
And that's space.
Absolutely. I think that's a...
And that doesn't make it God, he says.
Yes,
Remember
exactly.
Graaff.
Yes, I think this is an absolutely central point because, especially in the context of De Graaff Tatianna, which is so virulently anti-Cartesian, with so many nasty remarks, like he should be corrected. You know, Descartes doesn't even use a word in a grammatically correct fashion. I mean, that's, you know. But one of the only places where Newton tips his hat to Descartes is he says, I see that Descartes might have been worried about saying that space is infinite.
Yes.
But he shouldn't have been worried about that.
Right.
And there's a shift from a tradition of thinking about infinity as having what we would probably call a sort of theologically and philosophically rich, a thick concept.
Well,
To think of it as more like a thin concept.
I think
Yeah.
Kant's move is to say that only God can be actually infinite.
Right,
All
exactly.
infinities must be merely potential.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So that's a really interesting moment in the text. One of the only places where Newton says,
Right.
I think I understand why Descartes was worried about
Right,
this
right.
issue. Yeah,
That's in Graaff, isn't it?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate your work in this paper. I have a couple comments and then a question as well. The one comment was on the necessarily existent being. I have seen that show up in the statement of faith that Newton constructs. It's a Keynes manuscript. I can give you the example, but he says we must believe that he is a necessarily existent being. So it seems like it does have a lot of cachet for him in a theological context, because it's very much written in terms of one of the basic principles of belief. So you're allowing that, as you seem like both of them, but I just want to talk about that one. The other comment is perhaps how the infinity of God has been disputed for a long time. I'm thinking specifically of the discussion Grant gives us in the space, the book on God in space. It seems like some of the medievals really did think of an infinite God extended, how does he extend infinitely within an infinite space? So I feel like that's, I think that's something that the more Descartes dispute can still be seen as, continuing or development within that traditional discussion. My question is, I'm trying to think through here, what is his substance? And it seems like in the general Scholium, he says we don't know what his substance is, and it seems like he pushes it to almost spiritual. And I agree with you, it is linked to his sort of omniscience almost, because he's substantially present. And it seems to me, I might be reading this incorrectly, that Newton's trying to do two things that he's not allowed to do. He's relating to God as the soul of the world in his way of saying substance, but then he says God is not the soul of the world in the beginning.
Yes.
And then right after that he says he's not the soul of the world because he governs, because of his power.
Yes.
But we've just said that his power can't be it, his virtue, it's got to be substantial. So is there a contradiction here that Newton never solves? I feel like there might be. And he just puts it to be like, well, we don't know.
Yes, I mean, I would hesitate to say that he never saw. But I would agree that the general Scholium is an internally complex text for exactly the reason that you're saying. I don't say contradictory. That's really fighting words for a philosopher. I think he probably did see this, and he had a lot more to say about these topics, but it's so short. We don't know for sure. But there's something else that I don't know if I think I said it yesterday, that I think is just as puzzling. So you have all these comments, and at the end he adds, as we all know, okay, that's enough about God, to discourse of whom certainly pertains, if you're studying the phenomena too, experimental philosophy, and then that. Okay, so my question is, if you take that seriously, how do I know, how does Newton know, that an actually infinite God is substantially omnipresent in actually infinite space by studying the phenomena, which of course are necessarily finite. And even if they weren't, my knowledge of them is certainly finite. Puzzling aspect of that text as well.
It seems to be by allegory, the way he describes it.
Well, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
I think Scott is absolutely right that we have to treat the idea that Newton is giving an allegorical interpretation very, very carefully, because for many reasons, going back to the correspondence with Burnet and other issues long before the Principia, so that's 1680, 81, Newton is very skeptical of what he actually thinks possibly of Cartesian influenced allegorical interpretations of Scripture.
But if it's just one sentence or something.
It's in here.
Yeah.
And it's from the Lives of the Philosophers. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And the argument
I will
for
find it.
actual infinity.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I have absolutely no doubt that you're right. This is anti-Cartesian in the precise sense that you mean, not just anti-Leibnizian, although it might be stimulated by the responses of Leibnizians. But I have no doubt that Newton is saying here, I'm not a Cartesian. But again, this is very close to this previous question. That's a negative argument. But you seem to want to say that Newton has a positive argument. What does he actually mean? Now, if you permit me, because I don't want to be unfair to your view, I'm going to quote from your book. You say...
Oh, God. That's really low.
It's fair.
Philosophers don't read books.
Yes.
Especially their own.
But you say Newton's conception of God may have affinities with the views of other 17th century thinkers, especially Hobbes and Spinoza. Now, that is page 166. I mean, when I read that, I fell out of my chair. I was going to sue you.
Well, Spinoza I can explain. But
is that what you mean? I mean, are you saying that he has a physical God? Because in the general Scholium, he goes on to say, he does not work on us, we do not touch him.
Clearly not physical in the ordinary sense, which I, try to explain. But he is taking a position that he knows will be fundamentally rejected by two traditions of philosophical thinkers. And so I think it's a positive view. And it's that, first of all, it's not just about God. Even forget God for a moment. Space is actually infinite. That is also rejected by his philosophical readers. Partly because they think, look, there's just fundamental problems with thinking about infinite quantities. And if you make that claim, then you are inevitably tangled in paradoxes, which have been known since antiquity. So that's a positive view, that space is actually infinite is a positive, contested, highly problematic idea. And in fact, it connects with the correspondence with Bentley, as so many things do. As you may recall, Bentley, according to Newton, is caught, we were discussing this the other day, is apparently caught in what they call a paralogism. And it's predicated on the assumption that all infinites are equal. And Newton intriguingly cites Arithmetica Infinitorum and says, no, Bentley, if you just read Wallace, you'll see it's just not true that all infinites are equal. And he gives the example that an inch and a foot retain their ratio to one another even if they're both infinitely divisible. That, I think, is his example. So Newton is very well aware that there are mathematical developments that enable us, he thinks, to evade some of the paradoxes about infinity that have beguiled philosophers. But in saying that space is actually infinite, I think that's a positive, contested view that requires a great deal of thought if you're going to systematically avoid all of the problems in thinking about infinite quantities, which, of course, Aristotle warned against. But as far as the view of God is concerned, I really do think that there's a substantive distinction here between philosophy and theology. Because theology is either going to be natural theology by studying phenomena, or it's going to be scriptural interpretation. And I strongly agree with Scott that the citations in the General Scholium do seem to be something like proof texts. We do not really get the sense that he thought, okay, this particular passage in Acts, which of course is cited all over, as you pointed out, forces me to say God is substantially omnipresent, because everybody knows that, everyone cites it, and they deny that God is substantially omnipresent. So I think he's got a philosophical reason for saying God is. So what does it mean? I think it's a view about the relation, a general view about the relation between a substance and its power that actually is discussed from Aquinas on, at least. And Newton has a particular view of how that works. Henry Moore had a view of how that works. And he thinks the Cartesian view of how that works, and actually the Leibnizian view of how that works, are mistaken. We can go into great depth, but the Cartesian view that a substance can be unextended and yet exert power at a place on an extended thing, he thinks is philosophically confused. I also think he would believe that if the world really consists of dimensionless monads, Forget about how many there are. You can't articulate a clear philosophical view of how they could exert power on something. Now, of course, Leibniz is more sophisticated than Descartes, in my view. So Leibniz has a very complicated story about how that works using the idea of perceptions and reflection, and infinite number monads having perceptions and reflecting the way that the phenomena are. I don't know that Newton ever waded into that and tried to really give it credit and tried to figure it out.
So you're Newton, it's not Hobbes, it's not Spinoza, it's Henry More, which is the real analogy. But More has a whole metaphysics of spirit, which...
Yes, More has got a whole...
We have time for 2 more, I think.
Well, that's where my question was going to come from, which is, fine, but what the hell does Newton mean? Which is what contemporaries puzzled over. He's not Spinoza. We know he's not Spinoza. They thought he might be.
Yes.
We know an answer to that has been to say, well, he has an idea of the way in which substance and space and God work, which is similar to More's. But actually that won't do, because More has a concept of the spiritual world and of the way in which spirits produce action, which Newton certainly doesn't share. Not only doesn't he share it, he criticizes the way in which you would derive the historical sources for such a view of the world.
Yeah.
So Newton can't, even if Newton may have been influenced by the quarrel between More and Descartes in forming his views, his negative view of Cartesians, his positive view of how the world works, if he has one, cannot be More's view. So what on earth is it? How does God, let's assume God is indeed omnipresent, substantially and with power, but how does he communicate? How does this happen? More has an answer, Spinoza has an answer, Leibniz and Descartes have answers. What's Newton's answer?
Yes.
It's certainly not in the general Scholium.
Yes, I agree with you. It's absolutely not there, which is one of the most frustrating aspects, because he wades into a territory where he knows this is going to be hotly disputed, but he doesn't then explain what his views are. I do think he developed a view that you can see more in the queries. I don't say it's a fully worked out picture. I mean, one great danger of saying, well, Newton's a philosopher, whatever that means, is that he didn't develop the kind of absolutely systematic view that you do find in Descartes or Leibniz or Spinoza. It just isn't there. Partly because, for reasons that you all know, when his views were challenged, he decided to make certain kinds of polemical maneuvers, like in the general Scholium, that didn't commit him to articulating a systematic picture of how these things work. But at any rate, in the queries, I think you get a glimpse. I mean, look, in a way, everyone has a fundamental problem about 2 things. How does the mind interact with the body? And how does God interact with the world? And it's not an accident that they are together, because many people think they are related in some way, both for theological reasons that are obvious and for philosophical reasons that are not always so obvious. Newton seems to think, well, God can act on things in the world in a way that is as, but no more mysterious than the way that I move my own arm, right? He says that. Okay, well, why? Well, this I do want you to see that this is not a merely sort of brief, quick idea. He thinks there's a systematic connection between the way that God, which is obviously a spiritual being, interacts with the world by being present to the things on which God interacts, and the way that the mind interacts with the body by being present to the things. And that's a disputed idea. The Cartesians reject that. And Leibniz rejects that. And Newton knows that everyone in those 2 traditions reject that exact view. So I think More is, you're right, he's not functioning as a philosopher who gives him a positive view that he endorses. And I really should emphasize that more. Rather, he functions in a key way as a critic of Descartes. And Newton then doesn't develop a systematic account, I don't think, but enough of an account that you can say he seemed to endorse a disputed view of how substances act, very generally. And of course, I have many times wished that we would find a manuscript in which he really laid this out in great detail. But he was really a kind of opportunistic philosopher. He only articulated some of these views in reply to some kind of criticism. He didn't say on a, well, not Sunday, but on a Saturday morning, let me now do what Leibniz did, which is just write down as systematic an account as I can of my general view of these exact topics. We just don't have that. Anyway, I'm trying to be petite perception.
Yeah, sorry. There's a dispute that's closely related to this, and I was just wondering how you see it fitting into the question of God's action in space, which is the question of the nature of laws and God's maintenance of the laws, because this is certainly something that in Descartes was problematic, and Spinoza and Leibniz both respond to it. And I wonder how you see that relating, and this connects with the queries, as you mentioned, Newton's comments about active and passive principles. It's somewhat distinct. I mean, it's not something he highlights in the general Scholium in the same way, but I wonder how you think his views about God's relation to space connect with the view about God's relation to laws.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And in some ways that comes out most, of course, in the correspondence with Clarke. So of course, I have always said, we can't just take a sentence that Samuel Clarke wrote down and attribute the sentence to Isaac Newton. I mean, there are clear cases from the De Maiseux and others where Newton says, well, we really shouldn't say space is a property of God, as Clarke does. Intriguingly, this has been ignored a little bit. Also, Clarke says action at a distance is a contradiction. I don't know if anyone remembers that. Impossible. It's a contradiction to say that a body acts where it is not. Newton certainly never said that. Had he, of course, there wouldn't have been a dispute. So Clarke has views of his own that are not identical to Newton's. However, I actually think on this topic of the one you mentioned, Clarke is close to Newton's view. And it's clearly central to the dispute with Leibniz. So I think the Clarke-Newton view is that Leibniz is committed to a view according to which God, of course, chooses, well, we know more about Leibniz's views than they do, but chooses the actual world based on the principle of sufficient reason. That world is partly constituted by a set of laws that govern causal interactions. And of course, there are many other possible laws, but that one is chosen. And then once God chooses the world, the laws tell you what will happen in the evolution of the physical system. And God's role is essentially done, except for key moments in human history, of course, when God decides there has to, parts the Red Sea or something like that. Newton and Clarke object to that rather deeply, and of course there are theological aspects too to the dispute. And they want to say that this is the wrong picture of God's relation to the creation. The right picture is something like the following: God doesn't just choose the world or create the world and set up the laws and allow it to run, but God actively intervenes in the world as intended from the beginning of the creation, of course, not because, as Leibniz suggests, there's an imperfection, as if God is not a perfect watchmaker, right? That's the claim. But rather because God always intended to actively intervene in the world after the creation. And I think that's connected to these issues very directly. So they think, let's say, on kind of general philosophical grounds, certainly Clarke, given what I just said about action at a distance, they think that for God to actively intervene in the world, God has got to be substantially present in the world. Otherwise, it would be a contradiction to say God does such and such on such a day, but is not present there and then. And of course, Leibniz finds that just absolutely absurd, heretical, philosophically problematic, etc. But I think there's much more to be said about that. I think it's very closely connected to debates about establishing the laws and letting the world do its thing on the basis of those.
Good. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll break for 10 minutes and to the next session by Mary. That was good. Good.
Very nice of you.